starting to hear. I don't know if we'll have a formal introduction. You guys might just start. Oh, God, here you are.
How's your back?
Yep, more like that, but that's the number that I use. Isn't that amazing? Wow. Really good. You did? Oh, did she? 2 a.m. Mother watched last night.
They had a cake for the Italian.
No, I understand. That's how I do it.
My friends, thank you for coming in person. I really appreciate it. I want you to know that last night we had 1,900 people watching online. But I like you better because you came in person. I hope you enjoyed it and we really appreciate it. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay, this is working. Now we have to get the screen to work.
Yalla bina.
Yes, here we go. Okay, this is the second night of a three three-part series. I mean, in fact, we intended to have these lectures in 3 parts. So, but I understand that many people might not see the first or the third. So sometimes I will have to sort of repeat things as we go. So yesterday I just gave a sort of from the Medici side, not from the Jewish side. I gave a sort of a general introduction of who Cosimo III was. And I discussed and I explained, his background, and I brought up that famous duality, the two versions of Cosimo. Now, these two versions of Cosimo, which I'll go back to today again and tomorrow, make sense if we understand it in this 3-part series. Because today I will be talking about, and Gabriele will be talking about as well, the sort of the relationship that Jews had with the Florentine judiciary, the Inquisition, and of course the rabbinical part, the rabbinical judiciary. So but in order to do this, I want to sort of make you understand what was Florence at the time of Cosimo III. Yesterday I talked about Cosimo III. Today I will discuss what was Florence about during Cosimo III time. So yesterday we started, again, the series representing 2 people, literally, Cosimo III and Salomone Levi. Of course, we don't have a portrait of Salomone Levi, so I sort of made one up, that would make sense. I try to trace a personal and historical profile of Cosimo, with an emphasis on this contradicting personality. I use these 2 images during yesterday's lecture, and again, I will use them today and tomorrow, since they best incarnate his duality, or they best incarnate this paradox. The curious, analytical, intellectual, itinerant Cosimo, who traveled around Europe with a great desire to discover new peoples, new religions, new cities, and natural settings. The one who attended the heated debates on Galileo's doctrines at Oxford, or who spent, hours and hours recording flowers in botanical gardens in Holland. And then I presented the other side, the ultra-Orthodox Grand Duke, schooled and raised by enlightened priests, who was fearful of anything that fell outside the parameters of what we would say post-Tridentine Catholic dogma. So he, in a sense, he was someone who, more than anybody else, incarnated, the directives and the ideas of the post-council, after the Council of Trent. Now, we also examined, and I think I was a little too superficial, the impact that his father and his mother had on him, especially his father. The father, Ferdinand I, was a student of Galileo, was an avid amateur naturalist who collected technical instruments, scientific text. He was inquisitive about the world that was unfolding outside of Florence. Here we see him with a turban, dressed in Oriental attire, right? And then I discussed also Cosimo's mother, Vittoria della Rovere, right, who was a profoundly religious woman, and also someone who made sure that this religiosity, this ultra-Catholicism, would be instilled in the two kids, Cosimo III and Francesco Maria, who became a cardinal. They both receive a deeply, deeply pious education. In fact, we see her here, in the guise of a saint. Of St. Margaret, just to make sure that, that sort of Catholic feeling wasn't clear enough. Vittoria's austere and overbearing control over her son, did not make, as I mentioned yesterday, the life of Cosimo's new bride, Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, any easier, any better. The high-spirited and flamboyant French princess, as I said, hated Florence, hated the constant presence of priests at court, as well as the rigid customs, and detested her husband and the influence that his mother had on him. So, as I said, after 14 years of not living together, but being in the same city, she went back to France, and we never saw her again. Without being too simplistic, I think that these two identities had an impact on his rule. Now, his almost absolute allegiance to the Catholic faith did not dictate, of course, the everyday political agenda, but what had happened was that it allowed the infiltration, and I think even worse, the ossification of ecclesiastical authorities at court and in governmental positions. Likewise, as we shall see tomorrow, his personal interest in the natural sciences, especially horticulture and botany, brought him to sponsor research expeditions, botanical gardens, university positions, book projects. I mean, it was a real paradox. And we have to understand this when we understand what happens to the Jewish community, because it's very important. Now, it is not easy, I think, to characterize in a few words the political, economic, administrative, and cultural agenda that marked more than 50 years of Cosimo III's rule. So I have to be, again, very simplistic, very generalizing. Let's not forget, however, and this is very important, that Cosimo III, became Grand Duke during one of the most critical and difficult periods in European history, in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, in the aftermath of the wars of the Three Kingdoms in Britain, in the aftermath of the Portuguese Restoration War. These are just a few in the civil wars in France, in the Franco-Spanish War. All this happened before he became Grand Duke, and all these had repercussions. If you go on Wikipedia and look at the list of 17th century wars, it's endless. I had to pick 3 or 4, but I mean, it wasn't hard to find 3. I just picked the most famous ones. And also, another period, this period was called the General Crisis especially by British historians, the 17th century, right? And it was also marked by an enfilade of devastating plagues, the famous Manzonian plague of 1629-33, the plague of Seville in the 50s, the Neapolitan plague of 56, the Great Plague of London in 1665-66. And also, as I said yesterday, Cosimo III inherited the consequences of more local crises, such as the wars of Castro, that almost completely drained the Grand Ducal coffers. And a series also of devastating famines. One occurred the very year that Cosimo became Grand Duke. I'm telling you this because there's also, the outside. This is not just the Cosimo III, the figure, the historical figure. So Cosimo III came to power also during the crystallization of European nation-states, and also the consolidation of their colonial empires. Tuscany, in a sense, was no longer part of this elite group of superpowers, especially since the European arena of profit and conflict was gradually but inevitably shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Now, under Ferdinand II, under Cosimo's father, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany kept as uninvolved as possible, though it could not avoid financial obligation in support of the Allied states, financial obligations that cost Tuscany an arm and a leg, to be honest. But this neutrality or independence soon morphed into anonymity, or at least relegated Tuscany to a more peripheral dimension after a century of political prominence and diplomatic prominence. So, in truth, in the first decades of his rule, so in the last quarter of the 17th century, Cosimo had little to offer to Europe of the upper echelons. Medici offspring, once bargaining chips to be married in exchange of power and cash, had lost their value. His 3 children married well, but not that great, and most importantly, all 3 of them produced no heirs, effectively putting an end to the dynastic line of the Medici. Cosimo's miserable marriage with Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, the cousin of King Louis XIV, certainly did not fortify the Tuscan-French bonds, the Tuscan-French relations, especially after Marguerite badmouthed her husband nonstop once she returned to Paris. Nor did Cosimo's fascination for Britain in any way galvanize the relation between these two countries, though Cosimo often employed English intermediaries for a lot of things, especially when he was dealing with financial and diplomatic affairs with the Ottoman Empire. Cosimo needed to find solutions to mitigate what was really an unstoppable recession. What did he do? He turned to his own land to find resources. He promoted important agrarian reforms, and tomorrow you shall see how these reforms, in a sense, these agrarian reforms, were intrinsically linked to artistic production and collection patterns. Grain and grapes were massively cultivated and sold, along with fruits and vegetables, not to speak of plants and flowers. As I said, this is very important when we look at the quote-unquote Jewish Caravaggio tomorrow. Wine produced in Tuscany, for instance, was widely exported into England and France and Spain. Not only that, Cosimo implanted a great variety of foreign vines, many of which were celebrated in the pictures of court painter Bartolomeo Bimbi and by the famous 1685 collection of poems Bacco in Toscana, written by Cosimo's doctor Francesco Redi. Agricultural productivity was at the center of the economic policies. And his intent, I think, was to turn Tuscany into the breadbasket of Europe, or at least of Italy, or at least make it self-sufficient. However, and unfortunately, his fiscal policies went way beyond what his subjects could afford. The high, almost exorbitant flour tax, which was one, and flour was one of Tuscany's most profitable and fixed assets, ended up paralyzing the production of grain. Another area which suffered significantly under Cosimo, and which used to be the flagship of Tuscan economic success, was wool manufacturing. Here too, Cosimo's heavy and unjustified fiscal pressure, together also with the booming of foreign wool production in France and in the Netherlands and Holland and in Belgium, what will later become Belgium, proved to be really a great blow to the Tuscan wool industry. So cannibalizing Tuscany and perhaps, I think, not exploiting in full the commercial expansion of the international port town of Livorno was perhaps the worst possible survival strategy in an ever-expanding global economy. It is almost as if Cosimo's emotional narrow-mindedness oozed out onto the public sphere. His conservative attitudes, born in a sense out of that obstinate religiosity, really were imposed on his people, and I'll show you how in a second. The clergy, which directly or indirectly gained control of his administration, executed his policies impeccably. I mean, the Jesuits became a real menace, and though I must admit their presence in Florence dates back to the previous century, at the time of Eleonora of Toledo, the wife of Cosimo I. Thanks to Cosimo, but also especially thanks to Cosimo's mother, Vittoria della Rovere, they gradually took possession of the offices of the public administration, as well as the most significant, as well as significant acreage of Tuscan territories. So, the intrusion of ecclesiastical authorities within the urban fabric reached its apogee with the empowerment of the Inquisition, which Gabriele will discuss in a second, which was located in Santa Croce. Cosimo granted this institution clearance to investigate and even to incarcerate those suspected of heresy, of witchcraft, of superstition, of apostasy, of sacrilege, without even checking in with the Grand Ducal authorities or the Grand Ducal administration. They became, in a sense, the morality police, especially the Inquisition, to which Cosimo granted significant powers. Ironically, the funny thing is that this special privilege backfired when the Inquisition questioned and later condemned a local female mystic that Cosimo was really eager to fast-track towards saintlyhood. And one thing that the Medici don't have, if you think about it, is a saint. They have everything, popes and grand dukes and queens of France, but no saints. So, on the whole, Cosimo sought to also centralize the Tuscan judiciary and place it under his aegis. In an attempt to expedite the legal process, he abolished the formal tribunal system that had been, really for centuries, independent from the Grand Ducal administration. Then it didn't last that long, and then it went back to a more independent judiciary system. However, these reforms proved to be ineffective and soon had to be abolished, as I mentioned. Rather than sort of streamlining the judicial process, he made it more bureaucratic and in some cases arbitrary and autocratic. Florentine citizens did not respect justice in Florence, but feared justice. Under Cosimo's reforms, minor crimes such as like theft or vagrancy were now punished with exemplary, humiliating, and utterly disproportionate sentences. Cosimo was really known as the Rex Sacerdos, the king priest. And his narrow political think tank was mostly composed of obtuse enablers. Cosimo manifested this devotion, this Catholic devotion, all the time, whenever he had a chance, with pilgrimages and processions, by collecting relics, by venerating local saints, by sponsoring missionary campaigns in Protestant territories, by becoming a canon, as I mentioned yesterday, of the Basilica of St. John the Lateran in Rome. And this position, by the way, allowed him to bless the crowd almost like a pope. In many ways, what he did was he nullified the efforts undertaken by his predecessors, by Cosimo I, by Cosimo I, all the way to Ferdinand II, his father. He nullified the efforts of his predecessor to disentangle the Grand Duchy from church fetters. Well known, for instance, were his celebrations upon receiving news in late 1683 that the imperial army had defeated the Ottoman forces in Vienna. I mean, while reading the diplomatic correspondence from this period, one gets almost a feeling that he was pushing for the organization of another crusade. Also very well known, as I mentioned, are the epistolary exchanges with men and women, quote, in odor of sanctity. As I said, the Medici never had a saint. You know, that's one thing that they were missing. Cosimo also imposed a great number of moral bans, which impacted the everyday life of Florentines, such as the frequent suspension of popular festivities, including the May Day, which is called Il Calen di Maggio. He banned dancing near churches or dancing during religious holidays. And whenever that, when that got out of control, he enforced curfews. Luxury and conspicuous consumption were also persecuted, despite the fact that the cost of the court were very exorbitant. He punished cuckoldry, common law marriages, gambling, blasphemy, and what he says, homosexual activity, which, by the way, was the same activity that his father and his son were engaged in. He instituted a ban against public affection. You couldn't make out in Florence. Young men and women could not be, again, caught making out, so to speak, in public or in private, and the parents would have to pay a heavy fine should they get caught. He condemned prostitution, and when the prostitution ban did not work or proved ineffective, he made sure that prostitutes pay taxes on their services. Also, his puritanical views prompted him to remove the nude sculptures of Adam and Eve in the Duomo of Florence. These sculptures, by the way, were commissioned by Cosimo I, the founder of the Grand Duchy. So, I mean, he basically removed something that his great-great-great-grandfather had commissioned and placed in the Duomo. So in many ways, Cosimo III became the new Fra Girolamo Savonarola, the anti-Medici Dominican friar who wanted to rid Florence of vice in the late 1490s. And just like Savonarola, Cosimo had an axe to grind with the Jews. As a self-proclaimed custodian of the faith, his plan was to convert Tuscan Jews to Catholicism. Needless to say, his effort was hardly successful. However, he did provide a pension for all those who converted, a small amount of money. Cosimo did pass a series of widespread bans that limited the freedom of Jews in Florence. Tuscan Jews could not live under the same roof as Christians, nor could they live in houses that were connected via passageways or entrances or courtyards or terraces or gardens with the house of Christians. Moreover, Jews could be evicted from their homes at any time if necessary, whether they lived inside the ghetto or outside. Let us not forget that Cosimo enlarged the ghetto, and you can see the yellow part of this enlargement in 1704, in order to sort of forcibly repatriate, so to speak, the wealthy Jews who were living outside the ghetto in proper homes. And I think there were about 450 Jews who were brought back into the ghetto. So Jews could not have sexual relations with Christian prostitutes and vice versa. Christian wet nurses could no longer be allowed to breastfeed Jewish babies. Permission had to be granted only via a written petition. This was especially problematic since the number of births in Jewish communities in Tuscany was increasing. Jews could not hire Christian servants or employees. Jews were no longer allowed to work in the wool trade. Remember, the same wool trade that was once very successful and under Cosimo was not doing well at all. Many of these bans also established a reward for secret informers who could provide information about Jews who broke the law. But the bans inevitably fomented anti-Jewish sentiment on the part of the Christian population to such an extent that a new ban, had to be introduced to protect Jews from various forms of harassment and violence. So with this brief introduction, I hope that I was able to give a sense of what Florence was and Tuscany was in the late 17th and early 18th century. What I was trying to convey is the degree to which his state was becoming more and more static and unable, both economically and politically, to keep up with the very protean, very dynamic world outside of Tuscany. And most importantly, the world outside of Tuscany had a clear perception of this paralysis and aridness, which also concerned Medici succession. At a certain point, Cosimo III tried to concentrate everything to Florence. He tried to bring everything back to Florence. He brought back all the works of art that were in Villa Medici in Rome. So all the sculptures and works of art that were in Villa Medici, he brought them back to Florence. At a certain point, he does something very strange. He asks a functionary to do a census of every single building and every single villa and every single plot of land that the Medici had in their possession since the very beginning, since the Middle Ages. A lot of them that they didn't have anymore. Just to get a sense of how big the Medici, how large the Medici were at a time when the Medici were really declining. So even he had a sense that that dynasty was about to end. Now, and I'll finish. Once Cosimo realized, I think, that there will not be an heir that his three children will not produce an heir, right? Whether it was Ferdinando, who actually died prematurely of syphilis, or Gian Gastone, he tried to find solutions. What he did also was very interesting. He had a brother, Francesco Maria, who was a cardinal. He asked him to decardinalize himself and get married, and produce a child, and that didn't work out either. He was very old, and the wife wasn't so happy about this. But it was too late. I think the European powers were already trying to figure out who came next, and who came next were the Habsburg-Lorraine. This is the quadro generale, the portrait of what was Florence in the late 17th century and early 17th century and early 18th century under Cosimo III, and also under Gian Gastone, the last Grand Duke, who only ruled for a number of years. But by that time, when Gian Gastone was Grand Duke, the game was already over. Now tonight, Gabriele will discuss three cases. One dealing with the Florentine authorities, one dealing with the Inquisition, with the ecclesiastical authorities that I mentioned were really well connected with Cosimo. Actually, it was more the opposite. It was the Inquisition who was controlling Cosimo in many ways. And the last one dealing with the rabbinical trials. So thank you, and Gabriele.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. working? Yeah. Super, fantastic. Vediamo se vede. Okay. Okay, thanks very much for coming back tonight. It's fantastic to see you once again for the second time. It's really a privilege for me to be here. And today, as Alessio said, we're going to speak about Jews on trial. A very, very, I would say, vexed question. How was to be a Jewish, a Jew on trial in 18th century, 17th century, 18th century Tuscany? It was something very complicated. As you know, I suppose some of you are lawyers, have been experienced in the courts and been, somehow filed, and it's not a pleasure to be on trial. And to be a Jew on trial wasn't a pleasure in 17th century, 18th century Tuscany, that's for sure, but was not as dramatic as we think, as we thought, until as we normally think about it. Let me start with a painting, very famous Francisco Goya portrait of the Inquisition Tribunal in Madrid. It's a 19th century very famous painting that inspired some people. Maybe you remember, maybe you know Milos Forman, Goya's Ghost, movie about, a Judaizing person who was, condemned by the Inquisition for following Jewish rituals in Spain. And the lady was tortured and then was somehow banned from the Christian community, jailed until the lady became crazy. That vision that is over-romantic, romanticized, neo-Gothic, somehow pornographic, was inspired by 19th century post-French Revolution ideas of critique against the church. There were books written in the 19th century, early 19th century, soon after the French Revolution, portraying popes as torturers or somehow people having pleasure in seeing people, people, especially naked ladies, tortured by the inquisitors. The reality is something different. First of all, the Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, was not that terrible as has been normally depicted. Torture was one of the methods of dealing with, defendants. That is something that they assume for sure, but was not such a common practice, or at least was practiced as in other secular courts, where the torture was considered a normal judicial tools to deal with people. Let me tell you something, just to give you a couple of details about history. The Roman Church established anti-heretical trials and tribunals and inquisitors in the late 12th century. At that time, in order to fight internal heterodoxy within the Christianism, especially Catharism. But in the 16th century, with the spread of Protestantism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, the idea of fighting heterodoxy became more cogent. And one of the reasons why the inquisitors started becoming also anti-Jewish or started prosecuting Jews was not because the Jews were not, heterodox people or somehow supporting, promoting heterodoxy within Christianism, but because some Christians who had been before Jewish or forced to be baptized in the Iberian Peninsula by coming back to Judaism. This happened very often in Italy. In 1492, with the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, many came to Italy as Christians, but then going back to Judaism in Ferrara, in Venice, sometimes in Florence too, professing the old faith of the fathers and the mothers, of course. And this was considered a legitimate action by the church, because the baptism that they were given in the Iberian Peninsula was a legitimate and a point of no return for them. So these people were considered heretics, and then they were undergoing the trials, including tortures, and it depends what he meant. But normally a Jew was not a victim or a target of the inquisitors. The Inquisition is very preoccupied in marking a difference between a border between Jews and Christians. Remember, as we said yesterday, one of the fundamental aims of the canon laws drafted, written in the 5th century by the church fathers was to mark a border between the Christian community and the Jewish community. As long as you are respecting that border and you remain within your community, you won't be victim or target of the Inquisition. Well, once you get over the border and then you take one identity or the other, or you switch between one identity and the other, as happened very often. Ferrara was one of the main cities where these new Christians were coming back to Judaism quite often, but it happened also in the Gorn. In the 16th century, Livorno will become one of the places, shelters for these new Christians or old Jews coming back to Judaism. If you respect the borders, nobody will tell you that you are, will be undergoing a trial by the Inquisition. But what happened in Florence? There is a very simple case, in my view, very paradigmatic case. It happened a few decades after the establishment of the ghetto, exactly in September 1599. And I'm telling you this story that is, in my view, very paradigmatic. What it meant, not respecting the borders and the limits between the Jewish community and the Christian community. This story is quite simple. There is a young man called Salomone Ebreo Romano. Once again, Salomon Romano doesn't mean that he was from Rome. Maybe he was coming, his family was originally from Rome, was an Italian Jew, an Italchi, okay? He was found guilty of having personal intercourses with a Christian lady, a street vendor, a poor lady who used to go inside the ghetto every morning to sell buttons and other, simple artifacts. And they started meeting each other, becoming friends and more closer, so as to have a physical and sexual connection. But this scandal became a real scandal where the couple, the odd couple, I would like to say, were showing their ties publicly. And so Solomon was wearing rings donated by the lady. The lady was going to the house of Solomon, even though he was married with, and daughters and kids in the ghetto, and all those sexual connections and intercourses, and making a lot of noise, too much noise, that the co-religionists in the ghetto had to call the authorities to say, this couple is indecent, they are making terrible things, What happened then? The Rabbi Jacob, I don't know the surname of the guy, but the Rabbi Jacob was the leader of the Italian Jewish community, so the spiritual guide of the Italian Jewish community, decided to ban the guy, to proclaim a herem, an excommunication ban against Salomone Ebreo, okay, defining him as guilty of, not necessarily of not abiding by the law or rabbinical tradition, but by giving a scandal and putting all the Jews in the ghetto in potential danger in front of the Inquisition. Now, what happened then? While he was, denouncing Salomone Ebreo as an external person and almost banning forever from the Jewish community, something that happened quite rarely in Florence and generally in the diaspora, Rabbi Jacob found out that many others were doing the same things, especially youngsters. Young Italian Jews were bringing prostitutes inside the ghetto. They used to do that long before Solomon was found guilty of having this connection with the lady. This is the trial paper that I found in the Archbishop archive a few months ago. And these youngsters, including an innkeeper, the son of the innkeeper, and many others, were regularly bringing ladies inside the ghetto, having fun with them. So that scandal brought, a lot of preoccupations among also the Massari. Yesterday we spoke about Solomon Levi as one of the leaders of the political leaders of the Jewish community. So what happened? Rabbi Jacob decided to call the Massari, to tell the Massari, I don't know exactly which ones, but I suppose all of them, those who belong to the Italian Jewish community and the leader also of the Sephardic Jewish community, that this scandal was becoming widespread. And supposedly long before 1599, many other people had brought, Christian prostitutes inside the ghetto and presumably vice versa, and live in the ghetto to go with other Christian prostitutes outside the ghetto. So the ban was proclaimed. And some of the Jews, found guilty of these intercourses, even reacted, very violently against the authorities, against Rabbi Jacob, who was stabbed on the face by a leader, a young man called Elijah, who decided to not only to stab the rabbi, but also to remain in the ghetto even when expelled officially by the Massari from the ghetto. Why was this happening? Well, this was happening because the herem means excommunication. It's a very strong condemnation. It's something that it was excluding the banned people from the Jewish community forever, from the Am Israel, because it's an extreme, penalty. They understood that the penalty from a legal point of view was useless. So nobody could take them, forcibly outside the ghetto, or force them to live outside the ghetto, because there was a state law forcing them to live inside the ghetto. And somehow they exploited the situation. They exploited the vacuum, saying, okay, I could do anything. I can do whatever I want because your ban against me is useless. So what happened then, the second step? Rabbi Jacob and the Massari decided to reach another authority, not the state authority, but the Inquisition in this case, the only juridical and judicial body who had jurisdiction about these mixing scandals and violations. So the rabbi and the political leaders of the Jewish community, they called the inquisitors. They brought the inquisitors inside the ghetto, and the scandal ended. Now, what is interesting in this case, that we have we have a judicial and juridical vacuum. A ban is the extreme form of expulsion, It's a means being left outside the Jewish community morally and would say also physically, not being counted in the quorum of the 10 male for the minyan, for the prayer, so becoming nobody basically. But in juridical terms, this action was totally useless. So the only way to bypass this impasse was to go directly to the inquisitors. And the inquisitors decided to give penalties to the Christian lady, forcing to leave the ghetto forever, to baptize the son who was born to Salvatore Ebreo, and then to force Salvatore to remain in the ghetto and not to have contact with other Christians from that time on. We don't know exactly what happened then in terms of penalties against the other Jews, the other youngsters who had, a relationship with Christian ladies. But we assume that the scandal was so widespread that nobody dared to carry on the same way, at least officially. And this is a typical case of, as I said before, of an internal trouble that was somehow resolved by the inquisitors. It seems to be paradoxical. We have rabbis calling the inquisitors, and then also political leaders of the Jewish community referring the scandal to the inquisitors. Well, it is a paradox, but it's something that juridically worked very well. So that's something that happened has to be considered quite carefully when we think about, the inquisitors as those who were torturing the Jews because they were Jews. This is not exactly true. Now, according to the rabbis, someone could be banned from the Jewish community for a number of reasons, but paradoxically not for having intercourses with non-Jews or Gentiles. So the scandal was not tallying with the rabbinical norms, not even with the state norms, but only with the church rules. And this is very interesting. Now, the second case is a completely different case. It has happened much later, in 1721-22. In order to understand what happened, we need to go to the southern part of Tuscany, and more specifically to Pitigliano. I'm sure some of you went to Tuscany for holidays, for travels, and you went to a beautiful town. It is in the very south of Tuscany, near the Lazio and the Roman territory. Pitigliano became part of the Grand Ducal territories in 1608. Before becoming part of the Grand Ducal state, Pitigliano belonged to a family, to the Orsini family. I don't want to go into detail, but Pitigliano, a beautiful town hill, was passed, in terms of property to the Grand Ducal state, including the Jewish community. Until 1608, the Jews living in Pitigliano were not forced to live in a ghetto, to be separated physically from the Jewish community. How many Jews were living in Pitigliano in the 17th century? 300 people, not a big community, but, if you compare to the small town, it seems to be a good, average. Important Jewish community living in a small town. They have, given liberty, they have good interaction with the Christians, they have, they were in good terms with, even with the church. But let me give you an idea how it was. This is Pitigliano, the medieval town, beautiful. And the ghetto is just a portion within the city, okay? It's a tiny portion. Before being called ghetto, it was called Giudecca. Giudecca means just a place where the Jews are living voluntarily by themselves, in a concentrated area. Not necessarily a closed area, not a ghetto. With the coming of the Medici, that area was called ghetto. And they fixed some doors and gates in order to make it a real ghetto, isolated from the rest of the city. As a matter of fact, the good connection between the Jewish community and the Christian community continued until one day. This is the ghetto from the valley side. So beautiful. You have a vision. There's a beautiful synagogue that was reshaped in the 18th century. Not exactly our time, 1721. But we have a trial, something that happened within the local courts. I'm speaking about secular courts in Pitigliano. During the Corpus Domini a very important procession of the Catholic calendar, where all the people are, the vast majority of the Christian people in Pitigliano were bringing, the holy bread from, moving all over the churches, going to the final basilica, to the most important holy spot in Pitigliano. While doing the procession, someone stoned the priest and the people attending the procession. Who was stoning the people during the procession? One of the most important events, public events in the Catholic calendar. Nobody knew exactly what happened. Somebody was stoned. Someone called Simone Menconi, was a young man attending the ceremony, said that he was stoned, that he was likely injured. He didn't know what happened, but he had a lot of voices. He scripturally said that, we saw Jews stoning us. But more specifically, we saw someone from the window of Abramo Levi. It has nothing to do with Salomon Levi. Abramo Levi was a wealthy man living in Pitigliano. His house was facing the procession, the streets of the external, let's say, ghetto. But nobody saw a hand or a arm throwing the stone. So the authorities, the head of the Bargello, the police authority, let's call it, the police authorities started questioning all the witnesses. How many people? Look at these. We have a lot of Christian witnesses, those who were attending the ceremonies, those who were in good terms with the family of Abramo Levi, were questioned by the police authorities. And the matter was simple. Each one was questioned 1, 2, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. This is why the trials took so long, like almost a year, So what happened? I need to read some of the passages because when Abramo Levi was questioned, when the Bargello head asked him what happened, his words sound like, comic somehow, making fun of the police authority themselves. The point of this Inquisition is why someone threw a stone against the Christian procession. It was very important. Was it an accident or something done voluntarily? It depends. If it was done purposely in order to offend the Christian faith, the entire trial would be an inquisitorial trial. Much more severe penalties than at the end. But if it was an accident or something happened against a single person for personal reasons, there would be another different, level of inquisition. Not that serious. So the head of the Bargello tried to understand, really, if it was something connecting or disconnecting the Jews and the Christians in Pitigliano. He knew all the Jews very well, so he was not surprised that most of the witnesses were saying good things about all the Jews, including Abramo Levi. So Simone Menconi, the only one who was wounded at the time, said quite explicitly, I had nothing to do with the Jews. They don't hate me. And I suppose that something happened because maybe someone in my group during the procession had some problems with Abramo Levi, but God knows what happened. The only thing that the head of the police authorities found out quite clearly is that there were a lot of rumors by some Christians against the Jews. Let me quote some of them. Simone si lamentava, questi baroni degli ebrei, che non gli basta aver crocifisso il nostro Signore, che vogliono ammazzare noi altri cristiani, meaning, Simone was, was lamented, he was stoned. These Jewish barons, they hate those who hate us as trying to kill us once again. Or other rumors say, cominciai a gridare per mettere timore detti ebrei, queste bestiacce. And I started shouting in order to alert these beasts, Jews. Another voice, very serious, in avversione alla Santa Sede Cattolica, intenti sempre più alla loro giudaica perfidia, al di lei disprezzo e vilipendio, ne potendo contenere l'odio intenso agli riti e funzioni sempre venerabili dei cristiani. Is a witness saying, I know that they were against the Christian faith. They tried one time and again to they hate us, they try to, somehow to make our life miserable. A lot of rumors and anti-Semitic things until Abramo Levi, late during the trial, was questioned by the police authorities. I need to go through these passages because what he said, it's really, really almost comical. Abramo Levi said, who are you? Where are you from? Something very, redundant because everybody knew him. And what happened the day of the procession? And he clearly said, sorry, let me find the page. Okay, I really don't remember where it was on 12th June that day. I could have been anywhere, because, we, the Jews, are always everywhere around the world. God is my witness. You should trust me. We are like flying birds, sometimes here, sometimes there. I really don't know where I was that day. I have a wife whose name is Gioia, Simcha in Hebrew, and 2 sons, one called Diodato, in Hebrew, Matatiao, who is married to Pazienza, patience, with 2 sons, a male baby who is still breastfed and who is 5 months old, and a female baby whose name is Bella, beautiful, very Italian name. A lot of people come to my house, both Jews and Christians. We don't have any problem. They come to us often for different reasons. Sometimes to ask for vinegar, salt, pepper, something like that. We indeed have a house that is close to the hospital, right in front of the Church of St. Anthony, where the stoning happened. I live exactly at a stone throw from the spot. I don't know if by saying that, it was overemphasizing that it was, exactly over, just a few meters from what happens. But he used un lancio di pietra from that spot, a stone throw. So after the interrogations, the head of the police of the Bargello in Pitigliano decided to jail all the main members of the Levi family, just for preventing, detention. And then to report the entire case, the entire file, nowadays 2 big volumes, to Florence. Why to Florence? And why more specifically to the Scrittoio delle Regi Possessioni, the administrative branch in charge of controlling the ghetto of Florence? We don't know, but he suggests me, and I think he's correct, because the ghetto, the so-called ghetto Pitigliano, former Giudecca, with the coming of the Medici, became part of the Medici property, as it was a Medici property, the Florentine ghetto. So the entire trial was brought to that branch of the administration in Florence. And then what happened over there in Florence? The secular judges read the report, read all the interrogations, all the things done, all the transcription of the witnesses, and they found that there were many, many inconsistencies, and decided to reform the sentence completely, the provisional sentence pronounced by the Bargello authorities in Pitigliano. The jailing was illegal. The jailing of all the main members of the Levi family was illegal. But the point is that all the people that had been questioned, the Italian Christian witnesses, were giving different versions of the same event. So there were a lot of inconsistencies, and nothing could be proved against Levi and the family. Abramo, his sons, and whatever. Let me show you point by point why this sentence was so reformed, and on the basis of what. Number 1, Christian testimonies were glaringly consistent and contradictory. Second point, most of the witnesses are women, and according to Granducal laws, our Granducal laws, they said, women are legally not reliable, as they are mendaci, spergiure, and ingandatrici, mendacious, perjuring, and deceiving. Third point, the most reliable Christian witness is an 11-year-old girl whose stepmother had already problems with Jews. Fourth point, the Jews of Pitigliano always abided by the laws, and this is confirmed also by the local archpriest. 5, there is no cogent movente or motive for such crime. In other words, why should Abramo or someone else in his house stone people during the possession? Sixth point, this is very technical, very interesting. Ne bis in idem, what is in English called double jeopardy. Abraham had already been jailed, and although the duration of the imprisonment had not been determined, this would have constituted the reiteration of a sentence. So basically, re-jailing Abramo Levi, which seems like re-condemning for the same violation, and it was against the theoretical norms of the Granducal laws. The 7th point is the penalty of an unidentified individual cannot be imposed on an entire group of family on the presumption of collective guilt. 8th, a final point, the violation does not qualify as an act of blasphemy or disrespect of the Catholic faith, and then should not be transmitted to the Holy Office. So the Florentine secular judges are reforming the sentence and declaring Abramo Levi and also his family not guilty. Now, is this a manifestation of something that is changing in 18th century Florence? Or is this because Abramo Levi was a wealthy man able to have connection, perhaps, who knows, with Solomon Levi living in the ghetto, and then to forward the situation that in other times, a century before, would have led all the main members to the Inquisition or to jail? We don't know exactly why this happened. In my view, there seems to be a radical and a gradual change in the approach toward the Jews in legal terms. The Jews are becoming, we are in the mid-18th century, not officially citizens of the Grand Ducal state, but more independent, that we saw yesterday. It's exactly the same year, 1721-22, exactly the same year, the same time, Solomon Levi was buying the house in the ghetto, creating a social gathering in his house, and becoming a wealthy person. So in my impression is that the ghetto as a system is becoming more fragile, and this is a contradiction. Cosimo III decided to expand the ghetto, in 1704, as Alessio said correctly, because in 1704, apparently out of the blue, he found out that 104 families were living illegally outside the ghetto of Florence. 104 families means more than 400 individuals. How could it be that, out of the blue, he found out that 400 people were living illegally outside the ghetto of Florence? This is not real. Everybody knew about it. The ghetto as a system, as a system of social division doesn't work, okay? And Cosimo is a conservative person, Cosimo III. He's trying to reenact an ancient system. It doesn't work. It's completely out of time. The trial of Pitiliano that has not been studied so far was found just a few months ago in the Florentine archive. Give us an idea that something is changing, even though the judicial system is not yet ready to work as it should be done, should have done later. Now, finally, a third trial has to do with internal courts. Yesterday, I said in 1620, Cosimo II granted the Jews living in the ghetto judicial and juridical autonomy. What it meant? Why were they granted permission to get internal courts, judging people living in the ghetto? Why this privilege? It was granted simply in order to somehow to help the judges of Florence, who had already filed with cases involving petty things, so something very uninteresting. So getting rid of stupid things concerning the Jews was a way of improving the judicial system in Florence. So the Jews in the ghetto were given judicial and juridical autonomy. That meant they could create their own courts and judge people, only Jews, going in front of these courts. Who are the leaders? Who are the judges? There were two courts, rabbinical courts, bet din or batei din, okay, ruling over family issues, religious issues. These courts are independent secular courts. Remember, this has to be stressed. They are not to be confused with the rabbinical courts. Rabbinical courts are in the ghetto of Florence, as they will be in the ghetto of Pitiliano, Florence, Modena, wherever, Bologna, even in the ghetto of Rome. But they deal primarily, almost exclusively, I would say, with very religious problems like family law, divorce, conversion, and death, and whatever, this is the key point. Judicial and juridical autonomy has to do with something different. The political leaders of the two Jewish communities in the ghetto were granted the privilege to judge on secular cases involving the inhabitants of the ghetto. The point is, which kind of law is applied in the ghetto? Are these people allowed to take the Talmudic tradition and then implement these rights and these laws and then impose their decision on the Jews living in the ghetto? No. As I said yesterday about Solomon Levi is someone who has to be able to deal with the two legal traditions, the jus commune, the so-called the Grand Ducal norms, but also with rabbinical tradition. Rabbinical tradition is valid in the ghetto. It's considered a binding tradition, legal tradition. So as long as you can do it, refer to that. But if there is a judicial vacuum or juridical vacuum, the Massari, the judges, had to find a combination, a mixing, to basically to find a mediation between the secular tradition and the religious tradition at the same time. So, Yesterday we saw this document that is very interesting. For those who were not here yesterday, what is it? This is a simple but very significant paper showing how the court worked in litigator. There is a question written in Italian vernacular on the top, is about the meaning and how to do an oath in litigator. What is how to make an oath, a Hebrew, also called Jewish oath in litigator, okay? But not the same way the rabbis do when they deal with family or religious stuff. Is it possible to have a sort of secular Hebrew oath in litigator? And that, what happens, the Masari are going to the sources. They go to the Mishnah, they go to the Talmud. They bring the source, they translate into Italian vernacular. Then they put this in comparison with later sources, in this case, Geonim, Tosafot, other commentaries, okay, dealing with the rules of the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud, when they were ruling as political leaders, as you know. In the Talmud of Babylon, Jerusalem, the rabbis are also political leaders, okay? So they tried to find out if their roles can be transported somehow in 18th century Florence. So these papers are really interesting. We have a final resolution. We have a translation, and all these sources are combined together with the Grand Ducal sources until we have the proposal. You can do a Hebrew secular oath, okay, based on the Bible, but not following the rabbinical system. Now, from a textual point of view, we have something very interesting. While even though these judges, the internal courts, are writing mostly in Italian vernacular, because the text has to be understood by the people first, and the Jews indicate to speak mostly, almost, I would say, universally Italian vernacular, or Florentine dialect, or whatever, you know. The paper has to be understood also by the Grand Ducal authorities. After all, the Masari are given judicial independence, autonomy, but what they decide has to be binding, has to be valid also externally, has to be accepted also by the Grand Ducal authorities. So the text has to be written in Italian. But sometimes the judges forget that and they write it in Hebrew. Why do they use Hebrew terms? I found out, and I'm still working on it, that they use keywords. For instance, some of you are familiar with Talmudic terms and terminology. A contract means many things in the Talmud. So many things we have no idea. Like 20 contract could mean many things. It's something officially, done verbally, physically, with actions, with sort of emblematic things, you know. So instead of using contract, they write down in Hebrew characters, kinyan, or mikat ta'ut, an invalid contract. Instead of, this is another really interesting case, a concept of asmachta. What is asmachta? It's a very complicated legal issue. It means when you do a contract transaction, if there is a penalty that exceeds the value of the transaction, that transaction is not valid, at least in our documents. It's not like that in the Talmud, but it's something that has this meaning in our documents. So why the rabbis, the Masari, writing in Italian, sometimes to switch to Hebrew, and they also using Latin characters and letters, they speak in terms of asmachta instead of explaining the meaning of this concept, because it would take too long. They are using key concepts, keywords. So we have a lot of these terms appearing in the text in our sentences pronounced in the ghetto. It's a sort of making the text more reliable, easier, understandable by the Jews living in the ghetto, of course. It will be necessary to translate these papers finally when they will be transmitted to the Grand Ducal authorities later into proper Italian vernacular. But this is what happened. Let me give you a final example of an internal trial. Very simple, very, very simple. As I said, the juridical autonomy involves only very simple cases, mostly civil cases. For instance, I want to open a window, I want to tear down a wall, I want to enlarge my house, something that's very simple, very, nothing involving penal cases or penalties or in jailing, something like that, or death penalty even, not to speak about. We have an example of two guys belonging to the same family, the Calò family from Rome, and they have a problem. One guy has a debt. Let me go through these very quickly. It dates to 1652, okay? And involved two members of the Calò family, originally from Rome. Raphael is recognized as a creditor of Isaac for a figure of 31 scudi, a lot of money, and Raphael asks for the collection of the entire sum. Isaac declares that he does not have all the money and asks to be granted the deferral of payment. Since this, Isaac, however, has given a workshop of his own to rent to another Jew named Agnol Laudon, the judges, the Massari, propose and eventually they impose that Laudon will pay the sum of the rent directly to Raphael until the extinction of the death of the landlord, Isaac, in this case. So this is something very simple, something very straightforward, nothing to do with mixing of different traditions or whenever reasoning or something very complicated. This is a typical example of a normal trial done in the ghetto. So don't think about the Massari as dealing with crimes, with violations, something that has to be, with something that is extremely serious or, potentially taken to the death penalty or to serious penalties even. It is something very nowadays, something very normal, straightforward. And this is the different, way of becoming a Jew on trial in the ghetto of Florence. The ghetto of Florence is the only ghetto that benefited from these juridical and judicial independence. The Massari, I haven't told you before, were also allowed to create new norms or takanot, imitating the rabbis of the Talmud, formulating new rules and norms in order to foster social stability and to create a better environment. So this is a very complicated issue in general, but this is what appears from the papers. Last point, what we saw so far is just the peak of an iceberg, just one case out of 1,000 cases that we found recently in the State Archive of Florence, 73 volumes collection, an enormous collection that has not been studied, full of trials and full of cases of this kind, but also more serious, more complicated. In the next future, we are confident we'll be able to give you, to convey a more internal view on what meant to be a Jew on trial. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we have a question over here.
So let me give them this. Well, you know what, I guess if you have a question, you might as well, I can't really move this. Oh, actually I did, here we are.
In the event of murder, one Jew murdering another, who adjudicated? And in the event of divorce, was that basically just a get in the Jewish community, or did it have legal consequences outside the Jewish community?
Well, it's, to be honest with you, I haven't found a case of killing, manslaughter in the ghetto, but I suppose in theory, if someone had killed a religionist in the ghetto, the case would be reported to the secular courts, that's for sure. In case of divorce, it's a good question. I think the divorce recognized by rabbinical authority, a court, was recognized also outside. So someone who was married to a Jew married to another Jew in the ghetto, was divorced outside the ghetto by Christian authority, was considered a divorced person, even though at the time there was no divorce in Italy, as you know, in Catholic Italy. Yes, sure.
That screen behind you is of no use to us because it's all in Italian.
Yeah.
I would appreciate you providing us with an English translation at your next lecture.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, I've done transcription, partial transcription of the text, yes.
Yeah, I want to thank you for an extraordinary presentation. I'm curious how the Jews physically differentiated from the Christians in the period that you're speaking about. Were they prohibited from wearing certain colors? Were they wearing kippot or another the Levantine Jews were more integrated into the population over perhaps 800, 900 years. And so how did the people separate one from the other, just visually?
Visually, oh yeah, sure, yeah. Well, according to canon laws, a Jew living in the ghetto, even temporarily during the day, had to wear a badge, as you know. A yellow badge, or it depends on the time, yellow or red for men, and a sleeve for women, yellow, red. It depends on the time, depends on the cities. But there was a typical rule of the ghetto. Yesterday we spoke about the basic norms of the ghetto. A Jew could live in the ghetto as far as it was recognizable by Christians. So putting a hat or a badge, yes, definitely, yeah.
The doorways of the ghetto of Venice were made very short so that Jews had to bow when they went out. And usually there was a church that was placed at one of the exits or one of the entrances where there would be attempts at, if not forced conversion, there would be attempts at trying to proselytize Jews for Christianity. Was there anything like that, either architecturally for the ghetto of Florence or theologically at the entrances and exits to the ghetto of Florence?
Your question is very interesting because exactly just a few days ago, we finished our virtual reconstruction of the ghetto. We identified the different spots and entrances. I can tell you, I'm quite sure that there was nothing comparable to that. There were no, very short places where like to bow down before living in the ghetto. And in the ghetto Rome, and there were outside the ghetto, one of the main exits and gates, there were two churches gazing at the Jews living in the ghetto. So it was an attempt, an invitation to get converted. Nothing of this kind was in Florence. Even though, remember, a Jew converting to Christianism, or becoming Catholic, was not only welcome, but also paid. So there was also economic, financial benefit given to the converted people. But nothing done in that way happened in Florence, quite sure. Thank you.
So, you had a question?
Gianna.
I would like to know if you have any idea of how the things were working in Livorno, who, as far as I know, never had a ghetto, but was still part of Tuscany.
Yes. In Livorno, as far as I can tell you, they never, everybody knows that there was no ghetto. But remember, the rules of separation were enforced at the time. In any case, even though there was no ghetto, like in Livorno and in Pisa, because there were mercantile spots and harbors, the rules of separation were enforced. So it was not, Jews could not live together with Christians. And even though it happened, officially it was prohibited. In Pisa and in Livorno, there were also Massari who had juridical and judicial independence. So in Pisa, there was something quite similar to Florence. Political leaders acting as judges, but ruling over only Jews living in the city. In this case, not the ghetto, but in the city. It was quite similar. To be honest with you, I haven't understood the difference between the two courts in Pisa, in Livorno, and in Florence. But I suppose that paradigmatically we're working the same way. I haven't studied the sentences. I will do it, but I'm quite confident that we're systematically following the same system, yes.
When I was in Florence, one of the striking things was the church with the Star of David on it.
Oh, yeah. But you need to ask Alessio about it. As far as I can tell you, the architect who made a facade in the 19th century, right, was a Jew. And I heard some guides in Florence saying he wanted to have a Star of David on the front of the facade. I'm not sure about it. It's just a star with 6 points, I don't know. Yeah. I know that the guy was also buried inside the church. Corcos, something like that. Yeah, but I don't know what happened.
And the other was the statue of David is, he's not circumcised.
Oh, yeah. He's a classic hero, yeah.
Hi. Okay, so did the judicial system, like the state judicial system, or just outside of the ghetto, adopt anything from the rabbis' rules or within the judicial system of the ghetto?
Outside the ghetto, you mean?
Yes.
No, really, no. Not at all. No.
What about the other way around?
Sorry?
What about the other way around? Like, did the judicial system or the rabbis within the ghetto adopt anything from outside?
I would say rabbinical tradition outside the ghetto was completely ignored. I mean, unless we think about scholars dealing with the Talmud, from our scholarly point of view or linguistic point of view, but, judicially speaking, was, rabbinical norms and the Talmudic tradition was not at all involved in other cases. The secular norms were part of the internal judicial system in the ghetto because they were filling the gap. Because Talmudic norms, remember that the Babylonian Talmud deal with a community that is in the diaspora. And the rabbis of the Talmud are also politicians somehow. They have to fix the walls, they have to fix the calendar, they have to force the people to pay taxes, but they're also in charge of dealing with religious things, Some of these norms, not directly coming from the Bible or from commentaries of the Mishnah, are, they can be used to rule over the ghetto of things, and to be implemented, but there will be a vacuum, and a vacuum will be filled by using the external judicial sources, in fact, the Grand Ducal norms. Yeah.
Has any correspondence been found, or you haven't found it yet, but would it exist where certain rabbis in Livorno, in Ferrara, and in other Italian cities are corresponding with some of the well-known sages and rabbis, namely Maimonides or some other rabbis? Has any research into that specific area been done where they want a second or a third opinion?
Oh, the so-called Shelot Teshuvot system, it was quite widespread. Limiting our analysis to the Florentine sources, to the Massari trials, we found many letters written in Hebrew. I'm emphasizing in Hebrew, the so-called free language, the lingua franca of the Jews, between local rabbis and external authorities. Rabbis coming from, based in Constantinople, Florence, Ferrara, and they are writing in Hebrew because that is their common language. I haven't studied all of them, but I studied a couple of them. And it's interesting because they are dealing almost exclusively with religious problems, like Shelot and Teshuvot, questions and answers about specific issues concerning spiritual life. But in some cases also how to apply a norm that is not Jewish in a Jewish environment and a Jewish case. And this is really interesting, but still understudied, I would say. But we have evidence of it, yes.
Quick question. You mentioned, I believe, earlier that Cosimo III's son died of syphilis. What was that diagnosis based on? Because of all the diagnoses, without having modern medicine behind you, that it can be polymorphous in terms of the way it presents, in lieu of having teeth, in lieu of having bones. I guess, how would they have known that diagnosis?
From a medical point of view, I don't know. But he did spend a couple of months in Venice doing things that I'm not going to mention here, for which syphilis is sort of the product of.
During the carnival.
During the carnival, yes.
So probably time for one last question. Anybody else? All right, well, that will be the last question. Thank you very much. That was a great last question. Thank you very much. And of course, tomorrow night as well at 6:30.